Well, thank you all for coming today. We're going to talk about AI images and look at some of the challenges with making those inclusive um, and look at how we can combat some of that, how we can get better results. I actually do think that one of the advantages of AI images is that we can get better representation with AI than what's possible with the stock photos and cutout photos that we were using in the past. But that does not mean that there's not some challenges. The good news is things are actually a lot better than when I talked about this topic a year ago for this conference. So we're going to look at where things have improved too. So to give me some idea where I'm what tools I'm going to talk about, for those of you who are doing AI images at all, if you're not doing AI images at all, can you let me know that in the chat as well? But can you in the chat let me know what tool or tools you are currently using? If that is a Canva, Chat, GPT, Copilot, um, okay. A couple of you have not done it at all, which is cool. This will be fine. Even if you have zero experience, that is fine. I'm gonna give you some prompt for American things today. So, I see Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT, the Adobe's integrated. Yeah, their stuff, Firefly. I saw a couple of some Firefly. Some of you doing it within Articulate or in iSpring. All right. And I see the avoiding them when possible, but have used a wide variety just to compare. So Christina, I will say if you have a strict no AI policy on images for your work, I'm not sure how much you will get out of this session. Um, so I will say that like think about how you're going to use this and admittedly maybe your policy will change in the future. So if you're just looking at what to do in the future, that's all right. So the tools I use in my work, um, I use Midjourney quite a bit for my blog. I use a tool called Flora, which nobody mentioned, but is a specialized tool. It's basically instead of doing it in a chat interface, it's an all-in-one canvas with access to um, a lot of different models. Nano Banana, which is the image model in Gemini. So those of you who mentioned Gemini, I have used ChatGPT. Those of you who are doing Copilot, ChatGPT is it's ChatGPT with some tuning in Copilot. I've used some other tools, Flux, Recraft, Brushless, some other tools. So the prompt tips that I'm going to share later generally apply kind of regardless of the tool. So even if you're doing things in Canva or in Articulate, there's sometimes some differences in the formatting, but um, but generally speaking, regardless of what tools you are using, it should be all right. I see, Jocelyn, the question of subscription. So one thing about AI images is that unless it's something where it is already embedded in the tools that you are using that you're already paying for, like those of you using it in Articulate or iSpring, if you are using a free tool for image generation, it is probably not licensed for commercial use. Um, there are just a bunch of there's different terms of use for these, but know that there are definitely free options. Flux, for example, is one of the ones that is free. Brushless has some free. You can Nano Banana or Gemini is probably the best of the free models right now. But if you use it on free plan, it's not licensed for commercial use. Um, as a university, you would have to check the terms of use. But they're generally licensed for personal use, not work use. And I would say even a nonprofit university or a nonprofit or education use is probably against the terms of service. Not that, look, I mean, every AI tool wants to be in education right now, so they're probably not going to come after anybody in either a school or a university because they want everybody in the universities to use their tools more. but just for the record, you have to check. So let's talk about the bias of in AI images and the problem of this. So now we have this problem actually in our stock images too. So give me an answer in the chat. How would you describe a typical person in a stock image? When you picture them, what do they look like? And thanks, April, for linking to that stock photo site too. I actually have that one bookmarked too. I see happy and smiling in stock photos. Yep, they are white, male. I like the Scandinavian. Yep. Affluent, happy, conventionally attractive. Middle age, I would say middle age or younger. I would say there's a lot of 20 somethings I see in stock photos. White, sitting in a really nice home environment. Vanilla, yeah, yeah. It's the people like this, right? Everybody's white. I love that somebody put beards in here because both of these guys have beards too, right? I mean, I went looking for an extremely stereotypical, but it's that overly cheerful. Everybody's smile has been whitened. Everybody's teeth are perfect. They're all in suits. And yes, it's clearly, a Friday and they're all happy. Yes. Um, and it is that picture perfect model. And part of the problem with AI, so this has been a problem in stock photos. Like this has been one of our challenges in doing images for training for forever because stock photos are generally they're creating things for marketing purposes where things are overly perfect rather than what we want, which is a lot more authentic. And the AI images are also trained on these stock images that have not great representation along a whole bunch of different dimensions. So the bias in AI images comes partly from those source images. It is also enhanced by the fact that AI is always predicting what's likely. And what's likely often reinforces stereotypes. And so I think it is a challenge both from the source material, which had its own bias, and then knowing that AI can amplify the stereotypes and bias, which means if we are passive about how we use AI, it is going to reinforce bias and stereotypes. We have to actively work against that in order to create inclusive images. So I did a series of kind of tests of these actually are, I think, all from Midjourney, what I'll show, but you would get similar results from probably any of the tools, unless, with some exceptions of sometimes tools have been tuned to try to have better representation. But if you do a very generic prompt for a CEO, you get a bunch of white guys in suits, right? Which is kind of what we might expect. If you prompt for a doctor, it'll almost always be male. If you prompt for a nurse, you're not going to get a male nurse unless you prompt specifically for that. Criminal, yeah, librarian, library workers, teacher. If you show, I know somebody was talking about childcare. If you show like childcare and have childcare workers, they're all going to be women. Firefighters are all going to be men, right? A manager talking to an employee. When I did this in Midjourney, out of the 8 people shown, 7 are men. An autistic person, I think representation of disabilities. And autism is clearly going to be one that's a little challenging to represent But just like if you go search in a typical stock library for images representing autism, where you're going to get white boys because of a whole bunch of historical reasons related to how we've depicted that. I think the red hair, yeah, the curly hair is an interesting choice here. Yeah. But um but it is something it is one of those things where because women have been underdiagnosed with autism for so long, there's just not as much representation unless you're actively working to counter it. I did some updates, and then this one I did a little bit more recently. If you prompt for a person with a disability, Midjourney gave me every single one was a person in a wheelchair, and um, none of their faces are visible. Like representational bias in AI for disability is hard. Yeah, pregnant women, I will say, Jason, I love that. Chris Paxton McMillan had talked about that in a session that I heard from her earlier this year about pregnant women being really underrepresented in stock images. And if they are, it's that passive smiling while rubbing your belly shot and not actively doing a thing. Um, Yeah. And the wheelchair we know is partly because that's what it is in stock photos. And and let's be realistic, in stock photos, it's a lot of an able-bodied person pretending to use a crappy temporary wheelchair rather than the kind of wheelchair you would use as an actual person who uses a wheelchair. These ones, I will say, wheelchairs have definitely gotten better. This is one of the things that is a lot better in AI than it was a year ago. But I have a whole section on representing disabilities that we're gonna talk about. Um, there is Tristan Sylvester did a webinar for Training Mag Network a little over a year ago called Ethical AI in Design. And she talked about um, a bunch of research about the bias in AI and in particular on images. She had some great stuff. So, um, yeah. So I think that there's a lot of this representation of people with disabilities that is really challenging because like Jennifer's comment here, right? There's a lot of the images of people with disabilities tend to be either the pretend ones or it's the inspiration porn of showing people with disabilities overcoming great things. It's the exceptional ones because it's the people want to look at people of disabilities um, overcoming challenges as that inspirational thing because the job of disabled people is to provide inspiration. Yeah, but that's what that is. Like I heard that term of inspiration porn before, and it is that, and that's also a thing that you can get with AI if you are not careful. So, for those who are using AI, and I know not all of you are doing AI images, do you have specific challenges that you have run into? I know we've talked about, I know it came up about wheelchairs, of you hardly ever see like sport wheelchairs or motorized wheelchairs. I've got images of motorized wheelchairs in here later, so I'll show those. I know wheelchairs have been a problem, disability. Any specific challenges that folks have run into? Um, I think Louise and I have talked before about sometimes with the AI images that it is the overly racializing and overly stereotypical racial images. Um, Early childhood settings that don't have dangers in the background. Physical therapy without weird happy smiles. Yes, getting people to not do the fake happy smiles like in a stock photo. Yep. Religious representation. I can totally see that because that a Hanukkah image with Santa. Yeah, I'm not actually that surprised that AI did that. Color matching, I probably won't talk about too much in this. We'll see how if I've got time. Let me parking lot that. Um, Visually impaired. Yeah, no subtlety. Um, yeah, golfers were always white. I can see that racial Sebastian. Yeah. Um, yeah, overly stereotype appearance is when you're specifically asking for a person of color in a leadership position. I will say that, Jason, do you use the phrase person of color in your prompt? Or are you asking explicitly for a race? I am curious about that. That might be part of it. While we're doing that, I'm gonna go on. We're gonna talk about specifically on prompting for inclusive images and how do we do that. Okay, you are specific about it. Okay, great. I was gonna say if you said person of color, it would, would absolutely expect to get some weirdness. You sometimes they're gonna get it anyway. Fundamental thing, if you get nothing else out of this presentation, what I want you to know is that if you don't specifically prompt for inclusive images, you are not going to get them. As we've noted in our challenges here, sometimes even when you do prompt from them, they still will not be inclusive, but you are definitely not going to get them if you are passive about it. You have to be actively working towards inclusion in order to get inclusive representation. So this one, for example, was one, the prompt is down at the bottom there. A diverse group of people working in a modern conference room, a black woman, a Latino man in a wheelchair, and an Asian man. There were several prompt parts of that prompt, right? Diverse group. And then I listed several things. You are not, even if you say diverse group, you are not going to get somebody with a wheelchair or using a forearm crutch or a hearing aid or something unless you are really explicitly prompting for it. So the prompt structure that I use has several parts. I start with the image style. So photo or illustration will talk, give you some more examples of the style part of it at the beginning. Then it is the subject. That subject, we're going to include something about race or ethnicity in there. The action that they are doing, something about their physical characteristics. Um, and the clothes that they're wearing, sometimes the setting, any additional details. Now, the order of these, especially in the middle, is pretty fluid. But with most AI tools, what you put at the beginning of the prompt, it will weigh heavier than what you put toward the end. So the style and the subject are really important to get at the beginning of your prompt. And I will say some of these in the middle, you'll see in my example prompts as I go through this. I don't use every one of these every single time. But so here's one example. I have an editorial photo of an Asian woman working on a laptop in a sunny home office with a focused expression, blue coffee mug on the desk. So breaking that down with my framework, the image style, I use the phrase editorial photo. You'll see that one come up in my samples. When I'm doing photorealistic for training, I usually default to using the phrase editorial photo. That is not the advice you will see from other sources. I have found that saying either photorealistic or hyperrealistic or cinematic photo all tend to be too staged or too dramatic for what I want for realistic photos. Sebastian, you and I are on the same vibe today. Right? So editorial photo tends to be a realistic but journalistic photo. The subject, I have the word Asian woman. Um, the action that she's doing working on a laptop. If you don't have some sort of action, you tend to get more of that smiling, looking directly at the camera, which tends to not be what I want. The setting I had here in a sunny home office, the fact that I said sunny also affects the lighting of it. Somebody mentioned earlier about doing like showing physical therapy, but with people with giant smiles on them, or a male nurse with a giant smile while giving somebody a shot. If you say focused expression, that tends to help a little bit. And a blue coffee mug on the desk. Now, you can see here, I am not prompting big sentences. These are phrases separated with commas. This structure will work kind of across all of the tools. Some of the tools in particular don't do well when you give them a full sentence. We're all kind of trained now to working with LLMs where you want to give them a bunch of context. With image prompting, that's the wrong approach. It gets really confused when you do that. And so it tends to be much trickier if you go that route. So here's another example of this. Editorial photo, Pakistani woman. So I've got ethnicity here, that she is in her mid 50s. I had somebody who had complained that she said she couldn't get images of older Pakistani women doing anything. That every time she tried, they were really passive. She couldn't get them in a sari. Um, Now I did switch the order around a little bit here. I have a little bit more of her physical description, right? Her graying hair pulled back in a low knot. I have her earrings, her clothes and her earrings earlier here because that was part of what she was having trouble getting. I will also say this, the phrase in here of talking and gesturing with her hands is one that um, I do this talking and gesturing with her hands. That's one that I do a lot in my photos because it does tend to get that you're not looking at the camera. It looks like it does get a bit of that, like, looking in the middle distance that sometimes is problematic. But if you're just focusing on one person, that tends to be okay. The background here is at the end, and it is doing the blurred background that, is frankly pretty common, but actually kind of helpful. So in the two types of prompting, Nano Banana is the same as Gemini. Um, the Nano Banana, anything where you're prompting directly in an LLM, those are reasoning models that also output to an image. In those cases, you can do full sentences and phrases, and sometimes it is better to do a structured prompt with a label, which is the next thing I'm going to show. Um, with other tools, Midjourney, Flux, Recraft, I think actually this probably will work better for those of you who are doing it inside of Articulate or iSpring. You're going to do that shorter phrases separated by punctuation rather than doing the labels like this. Although you can try both and see which one you get better. In the LLMs, the Gemini, ChatGPT, Copilot, Claude, sometimes labels like this will work better than a series of phrases. So here I have that style, subject, action, setting, characteristic, and details are all labeled in my prompt. If you've looked, sometimes you'll see prompting with using JSON format, which is this JSON format, which is all kind of code and being really structured. And that absolutely does work, but it I think it's overkill for most instructional designers and learning and development professionals. This I find works pretty darn well. You can set this up. It helps you remember which elements you're supposed to include for your prompt. And then it understands this pretty well. So Nana Banana is actually doing a bunch of thinking behind the scenes. So when you do a prompt like this is obviously way more text than you should normally have on a slide, and I'm breaking the rules. But this is how an LLM processes that prompt. So you can see that it's sort of thinking through it, which is different from the diffusion models where essentially in other image tools, it's basically starting from white noise and then looking for patterns in that to build out your image with those specific things. And it takes each phrase and separates it into tokens and does each detail. So there is sometimes some different in prompting. And part of where I see people get into trouble with prompting for images is that they try to prompt in sentences for everything all the time. And even with an LLM, that is not necessarily always the best option. So something more structured, if you've been unhappy with your results, trying a structured prompt with labels is probably the first thing I would have you try. So, what details do we include? Like, there's some discussion in chat about the chandelier earrings. Um, and yeah, we do have to think about what are the details that we're going to include? What are details that make a character feel interesting and not flat? And how are we going to do our representation? There's a bunch of different aspects of inclusive representation. It is not just about gender and race. It can be ethnicity, it can be nationality. Um, we talked, there was a little discussion in chat about age in stock photos. Hair? Do we have women with natural hair types? Body type is another one. I don't think we've that's come up too much in our chat, but stock images tend to be model thin, and we can do better than that. Disability representation, we've talked about some, and I have some more examples of that later, but clothing is also part of representation. So this is one. Note that gender can also include non-binary people. Um, and so this is again, in this one I did a non-binary person um, in a wheelchair. I probably could have done a little bit more editing to say, why are there so many plants in this office? Because AI does really like adding so many healthy fig trees and other plants. Yeah, the wheeled type of wheelchair is one of these that is an ongoing challenge. Um, so prompts for trans and non-binary people. Jason brought up in chat. Sometimes in this one, I just did a kind of generic non-binary person. I didn't actually specify race or ethnicity, but I said medium brown skin. I will say skin color is also definitely something. There is some colorism that I have seen in AI images where even if I prompt for black, that it'll be lighter skinned, especially if you say a black person in management. Or I've seen the opposite of things too, of if I'm doing multiple of the same person, where ChatGPT um, made the skin darker on each iteration. Went to more and more stereotypical representation on each revision. I've had some of that. Sometimes saying motorized to the wheelchair or sport wheelchair. Sometimes some tools are better at this um, than others, but yeah. I will say, oh, and in if you're talking about non-binary people or trans people, I often find that I need to actually do more explicit description of what, because look, the range of what non-binary people look like is like everything. So I tend to need to think a little bit more about how I'm picturing that character or that person. Is this somebody who's more androgynous looking with an undercut, or is this somebody who actually, sort of presents more femme but is non-binary, and how am I depicting that? So you do have to think about sort of that character, um, or or think about what that representation is going to look like. Are you showing it in a hairstyle or in clothes? Are you doing some signaling? Race, ethnicity, nationality, um, that you can be really specific about this, right? I have done all of these as, Alaskan Native or Pakistani. I've tried all of these at various points and have gotten either ethnicity or nationality. My first example prompt there, I had Asian, and as been pointed out to me previously, that's extremely broad, right? Asian is a really wide range. So being more specific, um, you can you can be pretty specific and get good representation. Hair is another one that I think we you have to watch for. I will say some of the tools do better with hairstyles than others. And I think for myself, one of the things I've found as I've been working with AI images is that I have had to go do research on hairstyles for Black women because I didn't even know how to describe it. There's a bunch of things that I've had to go and do research. Fortunately, the internet is a wonderful place, and there's a bunch of people who are out there educating on things, and you can find these things if you go look, but you do have to then go do that research. Um, so I've also found if you're trying to do characters in a scene, Midjourney did pretty well keeping that hair consistent, but you have to really watch it if you're doing multiple shots of the same person. I will say the backgrounds in this were not consistent at all. This is also an older image set. Um, so just know, do some research on hairstyles if you aren't familiar with them, so you can get better at describing them, and then watch that consistency. Body type. AI images, like stock images, tend towards slender body types. Um, Adding average weight or slightly overweight can help counter some of that. Even I basically did the same prompt here and just changed the body type to see what I got as a comparison. Um, and even the obese heavy set here, I would say I would probably need to go a little further on that to try to get a little better prompt. But the the I'll put this prompt in the chat so you can sort of see what I did here, right? Now, okay, in this case, I did not use editorial photo. In this case, I did candid iPhone photo, which is another one that candid photos can be that. So you can see how I described her and the structure that I did for this. This was a set with Nano Banana with Gemini. Um, Sometimes another one that I have found that helps sometimes with weight is if you say rounded face. That can also help get past that really skinny, that model thin look that sometimes helps. Motorized wheelchair, I promised you that I would have this. So visible disabilities are still challenging. I will say it is improving. It is a bunch better than it was a year ago. Um, all of the tools still have need to make progress. Wheelchairs are definitely better than they were a year ago. I think every one of these motorized wheelchairs, I think, has a problem, has some problems with it, but they're better. They're less far off than they were, but they're not accurate enough. Um, this was one where I did sport wheelchair in here. And it's the back's better, but like look at the spokes in the wheelchair, right? So you're gonna need to do this, and then you are gonna probably have to do some more um like verification, or you may need to edit parts of the images because it's still a problem. Yeah, and the wheels are straight up and they don't angle out at all. Yeah, yep. So you're gonna have to do research, you're gonna have to verify things, and it is still gonna get things wrong. Assistive devices in general have gotten better. A year ago, I could not get any of the tools to give me a good forearm crutch. Because again, once we get past wheelchairs, things get wonky. Um, the cochlear implants are hit or miss. Hearing aids have definitely gotten better than they had been. Um, the prosthetic leg playing I was gonna say the cochlear implant, yeah, problematic. Some wheelchair images, again, I like got a wheelchair image of somebody outside and not skinny, so that was good. Other visible disabilities, the um Down syndrome or MS or something is tends to be very hit or miss and often pretty stereotypical. So better than it was, but not there. And sometimes I'm going to show one where I did hearing aid and like the number of iterations it took before I got something I was happy with. So, clothing. Um, this is something where we can get better representation. You do have to prompt for it. Um, and even here, there is some um, editing that had to happen. The woman with the hijab here, initially her shirt, the sleeves were like a three-quarter sleeve rather than a long sleeve. And so I did have to go back in and do another prompt and iterate on that to get the full long sleeve. But we definitely can with AI get images in whatever clothing we want with some prompting, with some iteration. And this can be another way to kind of do the counter stereotypes, right? We don't, if you are thinking of somebody using power tools to build something at home, the person you picture in your head is probably not a woman in a hijab. But we can generate one. And frankly, I think you're going to have a hard time finding that on stock photos, but we can have one now. This is something that I did in some equity training for educators about having the images that do counter the stereotypes visually as part of the work. So, some of this you are going to have to research. Accessibility devices, any sort of assistive device, clothes, hair, cultural details, all of this, um, you have to research. Um, I see there's a question here on when you get an image that's close, do you use it as a seed image for the variations? Yes, I will often use that as a reference image. Sometimes I, depending on the tool, so Gemini is pretty good at if you say change this image. Some of the AI tools also have in painting. I know some of you are using Photoshop for this. Sometimes you can do that with an AI, or Canva has that in the magic editing, where you can just select part of the image and edit that without editing the entire thing. And so yeah, I think, and sometimes um, it is, as discussed, as mentioned in the chat, sometimes it is easier to just open up some other program and do the edit yourself rather than doing the AI. And sometimes that's the answer. So a seed image would be like a reference image. Sometimes it depends on the tool in which you're going to call it. Basically, an image that you use that helps prompt it visually without instead of just text. And yet some of this is practicing with prompts to get them better. Some of this is also iterating. If you Prompt once into AI and just take the first result and don't do anything else, you're going to have more problems than if you work at it and iterate it. And yes, that it is the men do the grocery shopping, as was very much deliberately countering the stereotype here. My husband does most of the laundry in our house, and he is really appreciative of how many commercials now show men doing laundry, because for a long time that was not the case in ads. But it's a lot of iterations. I've been mostly showing photorealistic images, but I'm going to have a couple of prompts here with vector illustrations. So Jennifer asked about iterations. Does it completely redo the image and make new mistakes, or can you have it continue to build an image you like? If it's ChatGPT or Copilot, it is probably completely redoing the image, which is aggravating. Nano Banana, because it regenerates the whole thing even when you're changing one thing. Nano Banana is still also regenerating, but tends to be more accurate if you say only change this and not change the other things. Other tools, like I will go in Midjourney and just like literally paint on change this section and then it'll fix. There's some tools that'll do there are some tools where you can in paint it so it only liter changes one section and literally does not touch anything else, which is really helpful in that iteration because otherwise they do tend to drift over time. Um, This is modern corporate style can be a good phrase for illustrations. This was one where I did for somebody asked me about getting a Maori man using a computer and who did not have facial tattoos because AI, when they were depicting Maori, always wanted to put on facial tattoos. And so she was struggling with that. And so in this case, I ended up needing multiple phrases to get the style, whiteboard line drawing, hand-drawn marker, black and white to reinforce that style. Sometimes you will need to say it a couple of different ways for the AI to get the gist of it. This is still the basic prompt structure though. Digital illustration, also that one works. That digital illustration, I will say ChatGPT actually does pretty well with the phrase digital illustration. Colored pencil sketch can sometimes work. I've done graphic novel style. I think in the interest of time, I want to talk about the challenges. So, AI is sometimes going to fail. You definitely are going to have problems. Um, they will not always be as obvious as this one. The woman floating in the table is one of my favorites in my failures. It was a shame because this was one where the text on the whiteboard actually was pretty good in the background. And I was so disappointed because, clearly, yeah, this one was clearly not going to work. Fixing parts of the images. This was in Gemini, so I could prompt to make the sleeves just in a sentence. And it did keep the image pretty consistent from one to the other. I will say if you look at the face close up and if you look at the hijab, there are changes in this because it was regenerated. Groups are still harder than a single subject, especially if you have lots of people. So watch out for the faces in the background. This was a deliberately bad prompt. I used somebody else's prompt for this. But having lots of faces, even right now, is still likely to fail. You may not get quite as horrific AI gobbledygooks in the background, but you can definitely still get some of this like horror movie melty faces. When you have large groups, a simpler illustrated style makes the AI tool work less hard. So minimal detail, that can work better if you need to do big groups. No AI model can currently generate images of someone writing left-handed. Um, every AI model has trouble figuring out right and left. And so even when you prompt for that, That is a challenging thing, and you can prompt for it. Even when I tried like Nana Banana, and it thought through, and if you read this, it says, "Oh, it's it's the it'll say, bring up my laser pointer here, left-handed action, left hand," and it says this overall. You know those times when the AI swears it's doing a thing for you and then doesn't do it? Yeah. You'll notice it Nana Banana had 4 paragraphs of thinking about it and still put the pen in her right hand. Um, it cannot. It does not actually know the difference between right and left. So when you are prompting, know that when you say like raise the right arm, you may have to actually prompt visually like a sketch of a picture and say pose the person like this is going to get you a better result. And that may be the only way that you can get it. I need to actually try it with a sketch prompt to see if I can get somebody writing left-handed. It is a real struggle. I've tried doing the put the prompt in, like change the pen in the other hand. I have not had much success with that. There may be a way to do it, but it's really hard. It effectively doesn't know right and left hand. And it struggles a lot to get left-handed, partly because there's not as much representation of it. Disability representation. Midjourney has no clue what forearm crutches are, even now. Um, Sometimes I'll get these images and just, in this case, ChatGPT understood the forearm crutches, and they're not terrible, but did what is true of a lot of stock photos. You focus on the assistive device and cut off the face of the person. Hearing aids, it is better. I will say, like, this is one, and I can see in my screenshot here that this was 2 full versions ago in Midjourney. Um, but I've gotten some really terrible hearing aids. Sometimes, no, this is one where I did in painting and then generated the variations and corrected the errors there. But it took so many iterations of this to get one that I was actually happy with. And that is still true. I think hearing aids are better overall. I think Gemini does a pretty good job. ChatGPT is better at it now, but um yeah, I think there was a question in the chat about using anatomical language. You can try it, but I agree with PF Anderson. I think that this is you're sometimes you're going to confuse the model more. Um so know that it just takes multiple attempts sometimes. It is the thing of just like when you'd search for stock photos, you would put in one search and kind of get something, and then you'd try maybe 2 or 3 searches to find the thing, or you'd look through the 2 or 3 pages to scan until you found the thing rather than the first choice. Same thing with AI images. This was from a request from somebody who was looking for training for people working in nursing homes. And she said every time she was trying to do elderly women, it always ended up with white women, and she could not get black women. And trying to get them to do support bars in bathrooms was really hard. Um, there's a question here about giving the model a reference image, like a product image of the device. Um, Gemini is pretty good at that. ChatGPT is okay at that, but sometimes that can work. So if you're trying to show a really specific assistive device, that might also be part of the way around for wheelchairs, although you're still going to have to check on like a motorized wheelchair or something complex. Does it change the details? Um, Support bars in a bathroom. AI does not understand the context. And I got the wildest failures on trying to help her with this. Like what is happening? So yeah, so when you get failures, I'm showing these partly because I want you to know when you get failures, it's not you, it's the tool. Women's clothes, still some of a problem. I was trying to do a woman in an office, and besides the fact that it was having a lot of trouble with canes and crutches, every time I iterated, her shirt got more see-through. Some of the tools are better than others. Copilot and Articulate should be better about this, but it is still somewhat problematic. Um, the how far down is a woman's button undone? I did this one as I was testing out like an image to video tool, and somebody had commented on this, and because I hadn't even noticed it on my first pass through, and I ended up having to iterate and try to like get the shirt buttoned up a little farther. So, continuing problems. So, what I really want you to take away, prompt really specifically for it, do some research on the stuff that you don't know that you are going to have to iterate and verify the content either with your peers or through research. Um, Frankly, sometimes even just putting an image back in and having it evaluate, hey, is there any inaccuracies in this? Because sometimes it can even identify that. Using reference images can help. But um, if you have other questions, you can put them in the chat. I'm going to put my contact info up here. And I saw that there were a couple of requests to get a copy of the slides. I will put that. I don't have them posted right now, but if you, let me, I will put it up. Um, let me do, I think if I do, let me get a page route. I will put this. If you all bookmark this page, I'll post it there later. Which is just a handouts photo, and you can see that has my handout from last year. But I will put a copy of the slides so that you can have all of the images and prompts. I saw that there was also a question about, do I label the images on my site as being AI generated? Um, I did a lot at the beginning when I first started using AI images on my blog. Um, and then I didn't, kind of stopped doing that because I think because I sort of have assumed that people know, although I tend to label it as AI generated in the alt text. Yeah, know that AI images cannot be copyrighted, so don't use them for a business logo. I don't think the fact that they're not copyrightable particularly matters for most training purposes. Because you were using stock photos that were going to be potentially reused by a bunch of other people if you were doing stock images. So, like, not owning the copyright on it doesn't matter for most training purposes. But um, there is still restrictions on commercial use. Like I said, if you're not doing a paid tool or it's not built into one of your authoring tools, that is potentially a problem. And I will also put all my contact info in the chat here. So, did everybody, it sounds like most of you got at least something useful out of this. Um, question, Melissa's question on any concern with using AI images ethically of real people. So obviously the AI is trained on a bunch of things. If you're using Adobe's AI model, it was trained only on licensed images. And so if you're looking for the highest ethical standards, Adobe Firefly is probably the best on that. I will say that I think that the training in mass for AI images, I am generally comfortable with, but you should not upload an image of a actual real person and use it in AI and alter it unless you have their permission. There is a difference between it, you know, when the AI tools vacuumed up all of the content of the internet for training and it being part of it's like using data in aggregate versus using your personally identifiable information is two different uses. And so I would be really cautious of using somebody's representation specifically. I've even seen some of the stuff of like, oh, look, here's my image of everybody that I'm going to meet up at the conference with, all having a beer together. And I know in the one case that I was thinking where somebody did that, that I'm like, oh, two of the people that you're showing drinking do not drink. And I know that. And so like that's an inclusivity problem too. I just would just say ethically tell people transparency and labeling. I I may go back to labeling it more. I think the rulings in the EU recently are definitely in favor of being transparent when you're using AI. Um, and so I I think that labeling it, you're gonna have to figure that out in your organization of what your governance is. Um, Labeling it is probably the safer option. So, and I'm like right at time, but I have packed a whole bunch into here. So,
You know, Christy, I mean, this session went so fast. I can't believe that it was like an entire hour. That was like one of the quickest hours I think we've ever had on TLDC. So that was a great session. Thank you so much. There's a ton, just so much information. Um, yeah, I agree, Jennifer. Great, great, great session. So, Christy, thank you so much. And everybody, we have one more session left for the day. Vishali is going to be here to wrap things up with a session called True Cultural Appreciation and Integration in ID, Creating Learning that Respects Diverse Ways of Knowing. And that's how we'll be wrapping up the event. Christy, thanks again. I'm sure we'll be talking soon. I'll be checking in on the Slack channel. And yeah, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and close out the session. And next one, Nicole, is at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. So hopefully we'll see you all there. Um, okay, Jennifer, attend the next one and I'll tell you more about the Slack channel. All right, we'll see everybody later. Bye bye.